of all reality, the Father, okay, share his divinity in any sense with any other being. Okay, and then by seeing Jesus do things that were only ascribable to the Father, he said, no, Jesus shares the same divine identity as the Father. But how does he do that? And so it took centuries to understand the ontological framework within to make sense of it. And so we then get into the 4th century where we had the concepts in play to actually say, let's use the term ousia and say that the Father and the Son share the same ousia. And so they share the same essence. And that's how they were able to define it and declare it, to say, yes, that's how the Father and the Son share their divinity. They share it in this specific manner.
But Josh, wouldn't that be an argument against Christianity?
It's not.
Because
well firstly,
I think last time we spoke, you were doing like a PhD in philosophy.
Oh yeah, I finished.
You finished? Philosophy of science or something?
No, philosophy of religion. Actually, it was on the Trinity.
Trinity?
Yeah, the PhD's in philosophy. The topic was theological.
So,
it was actually about tritheism.
Yeah, and I remember like you know what you're talking about when it comes to these philosophical stuff. So the question really here is, I think we can both agree it is definitely something that took a long time to get our heads around.
Yes.
Even the idea of the Trinity, right?
Yes.
And historically, and also like you're doing a PhD in it.
Yeah.
But the idea of Moses, of Abraham, of Noah, of the idea that Muslims believe in, which is the pure idea of that God does not share divinity with anyone. God is one, singular, right? That is something that's a lot simpler than the Trinity. I think you can concede that point.
It depends so I'm not trying to get to that, but it depends what you mean by simplicity. What do you mean it's simpler?
Okay,
simpler
so
to
for
understand,
example,
simpler to grasp.
Simpler to understand and accept.
I mean, it is similar to understand if you just say God is a unitary person, unitary being who doesn't share his divinity with anyone. But then how I'll argue with that is going down, I don't know if you've heard, there's an argument put forward by Richard of St. Victor and Richard Swinburne. Richard of St. Victor in the 13th century, correct? And then Richard Swinburne in the 21st century, he's a philosopher.
The Oxford philosopher.
So the idea is about that it's logically possible for there to be just a unitary divine person. If there is a divine person, it entails that there are two other divine persons. So he's saying, actually, if you understand what it means for there to be a divine person, there must be other divine persons as well. Given that, the idea of perfect goodness requiring another to be able to instantiate the state of affairs of loving. And so if there is just a unipersonal being, there's just one person, he cannot instantiate the state of affairs of loving. He can only do that if he is in a specific relationship that he can share or that he has with an equal. And so he will necessarily bring about another whom he can share all that he has with, and then it goes on to another being as well. It gets into little technicalities. Sorry, I'm getting a bit technical.
No, that's fine. But I haven't heard this argument before, so maybe you can unpack it for me a little bit. Maybe I've heard of Richard Swinburne, but I haven't heard of this argument, so maybe you can just explain it a bit more.
Basically the idea here is that God has a nature that has certain properties. So omnipotent, he's also omniscient, he's perfectly good. Now, perfectly good being is a being who will only perform good actions and will never perform any bad action. Okay, we'll agree with that. A being who's perfect will never perform any bad action, will only perform a good action. Okay.
Is that the first premise?
Yeah, that's it. So that's the definition of God. God has these attributes. One of the attributes of perfect goodness. Now, the idea here is that there is one action, the action of sharing all that you have with another. That's called love. So they would say, instantiating the state of affairs, sharing all that you have with another is a good action. So I'll give you an example. I'm married, my wife, okay, and we love each other. The action of me loving my wife is not just saying I love you and all those sort of things, but it's actually sharing all that I have with her. My mind, my soul, my being, my everything, my time. I give everything that I have to her, and she reciprocates it to me. That is why love is really, really deep, because you give all that you have to that other being. Now the idea here is that God, or a divine person who has these attributes, he has a dilemma, because if there is no other being around, there's just one divine person, he cannot instantiate this good action. But by definition, God is a perfectly good being. If there is a good action, he would perform it. There is a good action instantiating the state of affairs of loving, but he doesn't perform it. doesn't make sense. There's a contradiction. So the idea here is that if God is perfectly good and will perform a good action if there is one, and there is a good action of instantiating love, he would perform that action. But then that requires there to be another equal whom he can share all that he has with, and that being reciprocated to him. Now, an objection could be, but well, God creates.
Okay, just off the top of my head, firstly, thank you for that argument.
Yes.
Because I think it's very lucid the way you explained it. I don't agree with it. But
thank you.
I understand your, you know your stuff. you know how to, you know how to explain.
Yeah.
So a few questions about this.
Yes.
So the first question is that. I'm going to lay out the questions and we'll go through one at a time, right?
Okay.
So the first question is purely going to be about that concept of love. So you've taken, sharing what you have is love, and God is loving, so you do that action. Right? So I would disagree with that definition of love, because I would think that's sort of anthropomorphic. You're taking what humans would do and then giving it to divine. The second point I would, just off the top of my head, would be why 3? Because it doesn't necessitate, you can say minimalistically it has to be more than 1, but I don't understand why it's 3. The third issue that I have with this argument is that it's about the chronological sequence, right? So is it the case that there was a being and then the being decided to share, which means at T0 there was 1 being and T2 there was 3 beings, if we're going to go with 3. And that would basically mean the nature of God changed, which again goes against the Bible. So these 3 objections of the top of my head,
I'll start with the third because it's fresh in my mind and then go through. No, there was no temporal duration or temporal delay in the inevitable bringing about of the second and third divine person. Because it's an inevitable action of the nature of that being. So that being, the first divine person, cannot exist if there is not, from T0, the second divine person and the third divine person, because he wouldn't have the attribute of perfect goodness. And I didn't say it before, but all of these attributes are essential attributes. The being that has it must have it if he's to exist. So, give an example. If God wasn't omnipotent, if a being wasn't omnipotent, he's not God. He has to have that attribute to be God. He has to have the attribute omniscience to be God. So the idea here is that if there wasn't that second and third divine person from the get-go, from T0, then that first divine person would not exist. So it's an inevitable bringing about of the second and third divine person.
So, Josh, would you say that this argument presupposes that these are necessary and sufficient conditions for that being to exist?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I want to attack the second one as well before I forget it. The second point you had.
Yeah, I actually. But
Oh, do you want to?
I want to dismantle this too. So if you're saying there's sufficient and necessary conditions,
yes.
Then that would basically mean that the very analogy which you began off with, or you've taken Richard's argument, which is you took an analogy which is about a choice. That wouldn't you do that? Isn't this an inevitable action you would take? How that seems a bit like it doesn't. It seems like a contradiction between that and then if it's always been like
yes,
that. So it's not a choice anymore.
Okay, so I think when I was trying to explain it, I sort of presented it as there's a dilemma, there needs to be a choice that God will make, but it's not like that.
Okay,
it's not like that. Sorry, I think it's just the way I was presenting it at the beginning for us to understand it. But what you have to understand is that there are 2 different actions that can be performed by God. Acts of essence and acts of will. Acts of essence are just things that God will inevitably do because of his nature. So, like perform a good action. If there's a good action here, God will inevitably do it because he is good, because of his nature. That's an act of essence. An act of will is where God will choose to do it, but he's not necessitated by his essence, by his nature. So creating the world is an example. God didn't have to create the world. He could have decided not to create the world at all. That's an act of will. What I'm arguing here is that...
Just to clarify.
Yes.
Would that mean basically, like in the Quran, and I'm sure in the Bible, I don't know the Bible that well, but for example, God does not do injustice, right? So an act of essence is that God would not allow injustice on the day of judgment.
Okay.
And an act of will would be, for example, that God made this tree and it has one main offshoot, but God could have two. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay, fine. So how does that link to?
Yeah, so the idea here is that the bringing about of the second and third divine persons are an act of essence. They have nothing to do with choice. God can't choose to not do it. It's just something that happens because he is constituted in that way. Because he's perfectly good, he will inevitably, from T0, bring about that second divine person and the third divine person.
But I don't understand, like, for example, the day of judgment is in the future.
Okay.
And if it's like an act of essence, you called it, which is that God would not allow injustice on that day. Justice would happen. Is where you have T0 and then you have T1, in which God, he will not allow injustice, an act of essence. But in this case, you're saying, okay, it's inevitable, but you're also saying it's eternal. It's always been that way.
No,
and
so,
I'm trying to understand how that works.
What I mean, I think maybe that example with the day of... Sorry. I think that example with the day of judgment's a little bit more cloudy. Let's just... If we can just stick with this example in creation, because I think it's a lot easier, then maybe I can unpack it. So what I'm saying is an act of will is something which God just chooses to do, but he's not necessitated by the way that he is. Because of him being...
I get that.
Yeah, so him created. An act of essence is just something that he must do. Off the top of my head, outside of the two divine persons, I can't think of one. So I think that one with the justice one, I think it can get a little bit more mucky, and it actually might be an act of will more than an act of essence. So if you can think of one off the top of your head.
But from an Islamic theological framework, and I thought this was true for Christianity,
Yes.
I'm not sure.
Yes.
Injustice is something God says that he will not allow, and also that like, but the way Islamic scholars explain it is that Allah gives laws, God gives laws, no one imposes laws on Allah. However, Allah gives himself, he gives himself, careful with the language here, but basically he says, for example, I will not do injustice, meaning he will never do injustice, right? So he has certain promises and he never fails in those promises, okay? So justice, I think it would be an act of essence from your perspective. But let's go to the second point. I forgot.
The second point was the main one.
What was the second point?
I lost it as well, but it was actually the main one. It was asking why three. I think you said why did it lead to
I think so.
two other divine persons?
And I've forgotten the third point.
Yeah. Okay, so that's actually the main critique. You'll say, okay, let's not give you this. Why does it lead to a second and third divine person and not more divine persons
Or less.
Or less? The idea here is because there are different qualitative forms of love. So you have cooperation in sharing your love and sharing your love. So I'll start with the first one.